today's event, we have a global thought leader in the fast emerging and crucial area of e-government and cybersecurity. One of the key individuals driving Estonia's world-renowned program of digital public policy. And during his presidency of Estonia, was appointed with several positions in the European Union, including, but not limited to, chairman of the EU Task Force on e-health, chairman of the European Cloud Partnership Steering Board, and chairman of World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council on Cybersecurity. So needless to say, there are few other people well placed enough to be able to shed light on how to bridge the gap between the technical and policy-making worlds and link the digital and economic development. Talking about how to digitize a country. Ladies and gentlemen, please give an incredible, warm welcome to Toomas Hendrik Ilves.
Close, except it's Ilves.
Ilves.
Labas. Cape Sakasi. Unfortunately, the only other word I know is how to sneeze in Lithuanian, which is ačiū. But in any case, well, I'm here to demythologize all of the hype about Estonia's technical advancement, which you might find hard to believe. But basically, my point will be today that it's not the tech. It really isn't. It's all of the non-digital stuff. And that's what I'll talk about, because in order to make use of technology, you need to have political will on the part of the government. You need to develop policies. Oops, where does the slide go here? There it is, okay. All right, I won't go through all this stuff, which is very boring. All these statistics, you know, we're number one. We're number one, actually, back to being number one in the Freedom House Internet Freedom list. And why I do point out this we're number one bit is that we are considered to be number one in the European Union in terms of cybersecurity, and we are number one on freedom on the internet, which is important politically to think about this, because you hear this nonsense all over well, if you want cybersecurity, you're going to have to give up freedom. No, you don't. You just have to do your cybersecurity right. So, where am I? This is basically, you don't have to listen to me. You can go out and have a beer. But in any case, they're really, in order to digitize a society, you really need what I already mentioned. You need a political will on the part of the government to do something serious. If you have that political will, which is sadly lacking in much of the world, most especially where I live today, at least temporarily, which is the mecca of IT, Silicon Valley, where you have amazing, amazing things that are constantly coming out from the private sector. But if you're have to do anything in the public sector, like register a child to go to school, you need to bring your electricity bill to do it. Or if you want to register a car, it can take 2-3 days of standing in line in the mecca of IT. So basically, the US is probably one of the most backward places in use of IT for public services. So basically, you need, once you have the political will, you develop a policy. Once you have a policy, you can go and create the laws that you need to have passed in order to have a digital country. And then finally, you get into the really boring stuff, which is once you have the laws, I mean, they basically create a framework, but then you have to do the actual regulation of what you need. So, and this is basically a few things one has to keep in mind before I get into the nitty-gritty. Basically, the most crucial issue is you need to have a strong, secure identity, and I will explain what that means. You need to have that identity available to lots and lots of people. I'll talk about that. When you digitize the public sector and government services, you should, first of all, do it together with the private sector, but you have to create services in the private and the public sector that people like, not things that the tax board of the Ministry of Finance likes, because if you digitize, you're much better at collecting taxes, but if you don't offer anything else, then you need a secure architecture. Architecture becomes very important. I'll talk about that in a little bit. And finally, what you need to do is guarantee data integrity, and I'll talk about what that means. So the system that we have developed in Estonia, which actually has taken, beginning with the planning, more than 20 years, but it was we began to implement in 2001. First of all, you don't invent things, you base it on existing standards, which is kind of like a no-brainer. We used open source, non-proprietary software, which is really Microsoft did that 12 years later, but in case we introduced this because we figured that's the best way to go with it. We had very strong private sector involvement and investment because they were actually in on the project from the very beginning because they saw it was useful. We set this infrastructure up in 2001, and since then it has operated continuously, and all new services that we offer can easily be plugged into the system. So the question is, how did we get here? Now, part of this should be fairly familiar to you because you're close to us. And we came out from the same awful mess known as the Soviet Union. But I have to go back to history and the special relationship we have with Finland. We always compare ourselves to the Finns, or we always wanted to be like the Finns. And Estonians grew up watching Finnish television, and so they knew what was going on in the world, more or less, minus critical comments about the Soviet Union. But for a comparison, in 1938, which was, as we all know, was the last year before, the last full year of independent Baltic countries, in which you could measure GDP, insofar as you can measure it. There wasn't a measure then, but anyway, you could measure it more or less. And Finland and Estonia had the same GDP per capita. It was low, but it was there. The first full year of independence, the GDP per capita of Estonia was, as you can see, $2,800 US. The GDP per capita of Finland was 22,000 US. And as you can imagine, we all have in Estonia this there but for the grace, well, it's kind of reversed. The Finns had this there but for the grace of God go I, because they could see down there and say, thank God we were never occupied by the Soviet Union. And we, of course, were there going, oh my God. So what is this difference? Well, one difference is this, right? I mean, at least that's what struck us, especially when we had this. No one has this anymore. But not only that did we not have, only 1/3 of the population had this, and the rest was waiting for years and years to someday get one. So anyway, so we had these big debates. What are we going to do? Some people wanted to be like Belarus and said, well, look, Belarus is doing okay. Follow the Soviet path? No. Some people say we should become Hong Kong. We still hear this. Well, we could do radical economic reforms, but those take time. And so it still looked bleak because, catching up, if you know what Zeno's paradox is, there are many of them actually, but it's where Achilles is running after a turtle, and the turtle will always be a little bit ahead of Achilles. I mean, this is a logical paradox, but that's where we were. Because even if we do the best things, still these other people who are ahead of us will be still ahead of us. The reforms will take years. The population was poor, though well-educated. And so a couple of things happened in the early 90s, which at least inspired me to go and stick my neck out and try to convince the government to do something. The first thing was this thing here, which is the first ever web browser. You had to buy it, and you had to load it into your computer via floppy disk, and it cost you $29.95. Someone's nodding here. You must be older, too. Okay, well, that's a pretty good reason. But anyway, but you know what? The thing that this did was that you suddenly had a web browser. And so you can, in fact, back then I was saying, well, what does this all mean? So I'm like, well, what this means is that in every other area, 50 years of advancement that the West had, that we, being prisoners of the Soviet Union, did not, doesn't matter, because everyone is starting at moment zero. And so suddenly I realized, wow, the web and the internet is one place where this little country, if it were smart, could do something. And then the other little brainwave I had was, in my own background, and that has inspired much of what I've done since then, is that I had this amazing one-off experience when I was 15. That is 50 years ago. You can figure out how old I am here. And that was, I had a math teacher who was doing her PhD in math education at Columbia. And she was teaching math in my school, and she had this crazy idea that maybe we could teach kids how to program. And so we had this little computer, we had a teletype with a perfo tape that was hooked up via a big telephone modem to a mainframe 50 kilometers away, and I learned to program in BASIC, which is like baby Fortran, I don't even know if Fortran means anything to you people these days. But anyway, Fortran was the main programming language in the 1960s and early 70s, and this was the baby version of it. And what happened was that we had this small class of kids who were a little bit better in math, and we all learned to program. Most of the other kids in the class became rich in IT. I didn't. But what did happen was when I went to college, I actually got a job. I worked part-time programming. And in fact, I worked on something called a PDP-8, which had only 8K of memory, which is the size of an empty email. And I had to program in something called assembler language. And at least it allowed me to buy rock and roll records. But anyway, so this gave me the idea of what we should do. So I proposed to the government. At the time, I was not in the government. I was actually an ambassador. But I proposed to the government that we can put computers in all the schools and we connect them. So this was the idea of the Tiger Leap, which came out and by 1997-98, we had all Estonian schools with computer labs and with connections. This program was also supported by the banks, and then they got this great idea saying, well, actually, we have every little village in Estonia has 3 banks in it. And everyone has a brick and mortar office, and they get a customer a day, but they have to be there. And so they said, well, why don't we digitize banking? And so the only real problem with digitizing banking is getting citizens to use computers. So we developed a program like the Tiger Leap, but for older people and people living in the countryside. It was called See the World. And so we ended up, I remember, 98, 99, touring the country on a bus, explaining to people how wonderful it is to use computers. And basically out of that, we had for a number of years, if you visit Estonia, you drive around and you see a sign, and it would have an and then it would say 200 meters to free internet. So we had in all kinds of public buildings, we had computer labs. All of that's disappeared by now because now everyone has internet and everything is wonderful. So that's just how we started it. But what happened was that we began to realize that if we're already pretty serious about digitization, that there's some real problems, and we have to resolve them. The biggest one, which to this day is a problem that causes or results in about 80% of breaches and hacks, and that's the fundamental issue, the issue of identity. And this is from a 1994, that is 25-year-old cartoon from the New Yorker. And that, let me get it on this side so you can all see it. If you cannot see what it says underneath that, it's one dog talking to the other dog and saying, on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. This is the problem of identity. So, if you think about what you need for an identity, is you need to be, if it is of any use, you need to be able to sign legal documents with it. And it needs to be secure. And so we tried to figure this one out, and we did. So in 2000, we passed this digital signature law, which is equivalent to a physical signature. And it underlies basically every transaction that Estonians do online. And to give you an idea of what Estonians do online, there are only 3 transactions involving the government that you cannot do online. The first is you cannot digitally get married. Secondly, a little more difficult, you cannot divorce digitally. You have to show up, both of you, at the same time. And then finally, which is of actually much greater political relevance these days, looking at New York and Miami and Londonograd, is that you have to show up as a representative of a company if you want to buy property. We do not allow anonymous shell companies, and you cannot buy anything. You cannot transfer property online. You have to show up at the notary, and you have to identify yourself. Those things you cannot do online. But anyway, so we sort of did that, the digital signature law, and this is really the basis of what gives us such a powerful e-governance system. All right, well, okay, you have a law, but then the next thing you got to do is roll out an ID card, and that's what we did, and you all have, I hope all of you have ID cards. But the key thing to our identity card is that we made it mandatory. Why mandatory? Well, we made it mandatory because if you think about it, unless you have most people capable of using your digital services, there is no investment on the part of the government, the public sector, or the private sector into developing new services that are digital. So basically what you find across Europe is that where it's not mandatory, the early adopters will go and get a digital ID card. So that's 15 to 25% of the population will say, oh, that's cool, I'm going to get a digital ID. On the other hand, if you're the government or if you're the private sector, you go, okay, I can save a lot of money if I invest in this new digital service, do the software, roll it out. But 15% of the population can use it and 85% can't. So this is another case of political will. If the government does not take the often unpopular step of making the ID mandatory, you will not be able to develop digital services because no one's going to invest in developing them. So anyway, that's what we did in 2001. This is what it looks like. This is nothing new for you. Next step was the brainwave that we had is that actually a chip-based ID card is no different from a SIM card, so we just extended the service to the mobile phone. Now, the point of all this is not to have a chip, but the first issue is to have end-to-end encryption. because if you don't encrypt from the very device that you're using, be it a computer or mobile phone, to where it's going, then you're subject to hacking. So you need to have end-to-end encryption. And the other thing you need is two-factor authentication, which is usually something you have and something you know. So in the Estonian case, what you have is a chip that is your chip that is programmed for you, and then you put in a code, which only you know and no one else should know. But this is something that most governments don't realize yet, and most banks don't realize it either. Well, some of them now because of the ADAS directive of the EU, but it's the system that we've been using since the early 80s of your email address and a password. That's one factor, and any password can be, single password, can be brute force broken. Anyone. If you have a short one, or if your password is 12345 or 0000, well, then it doesn't take much time for a computer to hack into you. If you have a long one with, numbers, letters, characters, well, it'll take a little longer to break it, but they are all fundamentally breakable. Two-factor authentication with using a chip and some other thing right now is very difficult to break, but it's going to get there. So right now this system will work for another couple of years, I think. I just read an article today that quantum computing has gotten to the point where if you use one of the standard encryption methods, which is called RSA 2048, which is based on 2048 bits to factor, prime factor, can be now broken during computation time of 8 hours. But that's just new, and I don't know, if people have, we don't have these quantum computers yet, but it's coming. In fact, this is one reason why Estonia went over to elliptical encryption. But anyway, so the main thing is that what underlies all this is that you can actually sign legal documents. And that's just not contracts, that's like everything. You have to, whatever you want, that you want to do, you need to be authenticated. Anything that requires a signature must be able to be authenticated digitally. My favorite example of this is I was in Asunción, Paraguay, a country that's very wired in the sense that every telephone pole has about 300 wires going to the next place. But other than that, very difficult. But I fortunately got to a hotel where I had Wi-Fi, and then I opened it up, I read my mail, and I'd forgotten to sign a loan application, and they said, well, if you don't do it today, you're in trouble. And so I whipped out my ID card, plugged it in, signed the document as far away as Paraguay. This also underlies all of the other things. All right. So that's the first part. The second thing is, how do you connect things up? How do you make sure that you get to see what you're allowed to see, but other people will not see what they're not allowed to see? And how do you determine those? And this, again, is part of regulation. And one of the things that we came out of serendipity, that is, in poverty. Back in the late 90s, early 2000s, everyone was building big data centers. And we said, well, we don't have enough money to do that. All we have is that every agency, every company, everyone has their own server. And to supplant that would be very difficult. So we created something called the X-Road, and that is a secure architecture, but it's a distributed data exchange layer. There is no central database. You can only access it by authenticating yourself with two-factor authentication. The idea behind this is this, that, I mean, you've read about, undoubtedly, all kinds of major breaches. You know, I think one of the biggest one was Equifax. You know, they broke into this company that had all of the financial records of personal financial data on 150 million Americans. Problem is that once you're in, they took everything. This is why you need a distributed data exchange layer, because it's like the lesson learned from the Exxon Valdez, which was the world's biggest oil tanker that about 20 years ago ran aground, and it created the biggest oil spill of all time. Why was it the biggest oil spill? Because there was one hold. Everything was in this tanker. After that, people got smart, and now they have compartments so that if you hit a rock, you don't destroy nature for 200 square kilometers. So basically, this is what we did. We call it X-Road, and I will, instead of looking at this slide, which doesn't really do anything, I'll show you this next thing now. I really hope this thing starts. Will it start? Yeah, it is. It actually starts. I hope there's sound as well. Is there sound? Yeah.
Running a modern state is a data-centered endeavor. Ensuring the functioning of the state requires administering very large quantities of data. Estonia lacks a centralized or master database. Data is stored where it is created. Each agency administers its own data separately, and data is not duplicated. At the same time, state authorities and agencies need data outside their purviews in order to function. For example, the police constantly require information from the population register. Likewise, the unemployment insurance fund depends on information from the health information system. How can authorities securely exchange important data? First, the data must be easily accessible by the authorities that are authorized to use it. Second, the integrity of the data must be maintained. No third party should be able to make any changes to the data while it is in transit. Third, the data must remain confidential during its journey. It must be protected from the eyes of unauthorized parties. The X-Road is a data exchange platform that fulfills all three of these requirements. The X-Road makes life simpler for both the state and the citizens. For example, when a child is born, information about the birth is sent directly from the hospital to the population register. From there, it is sent automatically to the health insurance fund so that the child will have health insurance and a family physician. This prevents the creation of excessive paperwork and saves time. The state functions in the background. The X-Road helps authorities make work processes more convenient. Many activities can be automated, which frees employees to deal with matters that require human involvement. Authorities also don't have to worry about the authenticity of data. They can be confident that data received from the tax board definitely originated from the actual tax board. Additionally, the X-Road can be used regardless of what technology an authority uses. For the state, the X-Road, above all, makes it possible for authorities to efficiently exchange data among themselves. Sensitive information moves securely, and the system itself is so resilient that it cannot be easily brought down by those with malicious intentions. Since the birth of X-Road in 2001, the system has operated continuously without interruption. The X-Road helps the state see the big picture of how different authorities are connected to one another. In addition, the X-Road makes it possible to exchange data not only within the country, but also across national borders. That is, of course, if databases and information systems are working properly. The biggest beneficiaries of the X-Road are, of course, the citizens. They enjoy the benefits of a better functioning state and save all of the time they would otherwise spend submitting papers and forms. How much time? During the time it took you to watch this animation, the X-Road saved around 240 working hours in Estonia. Cool.
That we calculate based on time saved that it amounts to about 2% of GDP a year. So I like to say we get our NATO membership for free because it pays for our NATO membership to save all this money. Right now, the system is in various forms and stages of development in about 15 countries. Most prominently, of course, is Finland, which, since we give away the platform, and Finland has an ID, they implemented this and actually took it we've taken together with Finland one step further, which is that we have almost mutual recognition of prescriptions. Now, we get a lot of Finns every year, around 7-8 million visits. And they like to have a good time, and so they tend to lose their medicine. So I proposed 7 years ago to the Finnish president, Sauli Niinistö, that, well, look, you have digital prescriptions, we have digital prescriptions, why don't we make them interoperable? So if you're a Finn and you come to Estonia and you lose your prescription, you can just write or call your doctor up there in northern Lapland or something, and you can get your prescription here. He said it was a great idea. 7 years later, it finally works in one direction. That illustrates something which is technologically would have taken probably at most 3 weeks to set up. But in order to do all of the regulatory side of things, it took 7 years. Because, you have to take into account all these things that, Estonia subsidizes certain medicines for certain groups of certain ages, and Finland subsidizes other medicines for different ages, and they're different medicines. And to get that all worked out took all this time. The other problem with it is that Estonia, following the ADAS directive, basically everyone has to offer the same services. According to the ADAS directive, every government has to offer the same services to other citizens or citizens of the EU countries from other places as they do to their own. The problem is that for Estonia, the problem is that everyone can use all these services in Estonia, but it doesn't work the other way around, especially if you don't really have the service. So right now, Finns coming to Estonia, they can get their medicine. Estonians go to Finland, But that's a minor point. Let me, however, get to the several intellectual, fundamental, philosophical issues of digitization if you do it this way. And the most important thing that comes out of that is to understand the difference between serial and parallel processing. Serial processing, or also known as sequential processing, is that you do one thing, and then you do another thing, and a third thing. And where the way bureaucracy has worked ever since people started having bureaucracies 5,000 years ago, whether be it in Egypt or China or Mesopotamia, is that you have some kind of record, and you have a piece of paper or you have a clay tablet, papyrus, and you go to the official, and then he says, okay, and then it goes to the next department. And then someone gets the paper, and they go look in the file cabinet, comes back, says, okay, puts a stamp on it. Then it goes to the next place, and the next place, and that's what bureaucracy is about. In Italy, a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, if you wanted to open a business in Italy, that bureaucracy, because you had to check, okay, did you pay your taxes? Did you pay your alimony? Have you paid your traffic tickets? Have you committed crimes? Have you gone bankrupt? Every one of those things has to be checked in every EU country if you want to open a business. But it goes from one office to another office to another office, and the time, at that time when I last looked, it took 18 months to get approval to open a business in Italy. In Estonia, it takes 15 minutes. The reason it takes 15 minutes is that it goes out all at once. So instead of having a piece of paper moving from the Office of Social Welfare on alimony payments to the police to see if you've committed crimes, to the finance ministry to see if you've gone bankrupt, it goes off in all directions, and is done digitally, and it's simply checked digitally, so you get your answer back in 15 minutes. And the creation of parallel processing for governance via digitization is the greatest source of efficiency that you can possibly get, and it is why Estonia saves 2% of GDP a year, because it's all done. It also has tremendous effects on corruption reduction because it's computers, different databases that say yes or no, as opposed to an official who says, well, I'll give you an approval if you give me, blah, 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 whatever it is. The other thing that comes out of this also is our once-only regulation. This is also tied to parallel processing. And that is, in Estonia, the government may not ask you for any information that it already has. That is, if once you identify yourself with your identity, then you don't have to write your address, your telephone number, your email. You don't have to, all that stuff that you usually always have to write down, and in a paper world you have to do all the time, and especially in the United States, you don't have to do that. All right, so this all comes out of the architecture. And the final part I want to talk about is data integrity. And this comes up all the time. People say, well, what about privacy? Well, what happens? Is this stuff private? Well, technically it's private. And, technologically it is private because the only people who can access your data are the people who are authorized to do so. And we have since every search, every attempt to look at something is logged, we know who did it. So we have, for example, strictly private data, and then we have public data. So in Estonia, my property ownership, what I own, is public. In fact, as a public official, you have to put all that stuff on, and private individuals too. And every 3 weeks, the local yellow journal would go see, well, has Ilves bought anything lately? No, but I would see, SL Õhtuleht has once again tried to figure out if I've bought something. So I got to know that they were looking at me. And so you get to see whoever's trying to look at you. But then, of course, when it comes to more private data, your medical records, the only people who can see your data are the ones who are authorized. And someone may attempt to, but you will immediately see they've attempted to and also failed. People say, well, I don't trust the system. Well, I personally trust it far more than the paper world. Because in the paper world, and here's a good example, there was a Formula 1 or 4, I don't really know much about racing cars, but anyway, Michael Schumacher had this horrible skiing accident in Switzerland some 8-10 years ago. And within 3 hours, Bild Zeitung, sort of the biggest yellow newspaper in Europe, but certainly the biggest in Germany, had all of his medical records and skull x-rays, and it was showing everything. That could never happen in Estonia because there's no way you could do that. Unless if you were an authorized doctor, but then you know everyone who looked at your data, so you figure out it's one of 3 people or only one of 1 person. So that's so much for the privacy concern. But privacy is the big concern all over Europe. Oh my God, is this stuff private? Well, so far we have not had any breaches in Estonia, but there's a much bigger issue than privacy, and that is data integrity. And that is the real problem we face in the digital revolution. Privacy is, for example, someone finds out my blood type and publishes my blood type. Not nice, or someone finds out my bank account, and maybe a little embarrassing to show how meager it is, but nonetheless, okay, no damage. Integrity is someone changing your data. Someone changes my blood type in my medical record. That can be fatal. Because if I go to the hospital and they say, okay, he's got type AB blood, but actually He doesn't have AB blood because AB is like the universal recipient, but instead he's got type B blood. Well, that can kill me. Or, more to the point, when it comes to your bank account, instead of someone publishing it, someone just takes away all your money. That is data integrity, and that is the fundamental issue that you need to address as the third pillar of a secure digital system. So since 2007, we have put all critical personal data, as well as court records, laws, property records, on blockchain. Actually, we call it a distributed data exchange, rather distributed ledger, which is the true name, but blockchain has become the hip word, and largely because it starts with a B, just like Bitcoin. I think it's overdone, and I hate the word blockchain. But in any case, that's what we have since 2007. Since we started the system, just to speed up and get out of here for you and listen to something more interesting, we introduced in 2005 e-voting. Last national election, we had 47% of the population voted online. People say, oh, but can you trust it? Can you trust it? Well, actually, I would say do not trust digital voting systems that are standalone. The reason why it works in Estonia is that we're using exactly the same highly secure system that we've been using since 2001, that we do all our bank transactions on. So we trust this system because the platform is something that has not failed us, and so people trust it. As opposed to, say, electronic voting machines in the United States, which are full of security holes, and some of which actually have even been breached by our friends to the east. Then I mentioned e-prescriptions. E-residency came out of the realization that there are a lot of things that are tied to identity and to governments, but do not require you to physically live there. So, for example, to set up a business, you don't need to live in Estonia, and that's kind of a no-brainer. People think it's a big deal, this e-residency. I think it's kind of just a no-brainer. And then finally, data embassies. I'll run through these quickly. This is when we vote, basically you decide whether, we got rid of the mobile ID thing, just ID. Prescriptions used to look like this, now they look like that. We'll move ahead. But data embassy is something I'll stop at for a second. And this, you may recognize, is a picture from Japan, from Fukushima. The tsunami that hit Fukushima, fairly devastating, as you can see. One of the results that came out of that was also the meltdown of the nuclear reactor at Fukushima. Now, one of the other results of this horrible accident is that Japan lost some of its data. For some reason, some of its data was stored in Fukushima or in the area, but in any case, one of the results was that some data went missing. And so we started thinking, right, we're Balts, right? I mean, I don't know how I don't have the statistics on you, but I've done the statistics on Estonia, and in the past 1,000 years, we have been invaded twice a century. 2 times by the Lithuanians, by the way. But that was 900 years ago. It doesn't matter anymore. We forgive you. Yeah, well, we haven't forgotten the other ones, okay? But anyway, twice a century. On top of that, the 20th century were invaded 7 times, if you count all of the armies going one way and another way and up and down and all this. So I figured, all this digitization stuff is nice, but what happens if we get invaded again? It's kind of a pattern. And so we came up with this idea of the data embassy. Some of you may know that there is such a thing as a Vienna Convention on on diplomatic immunity and extraterritoriality, which says that if you have an embassy, it is the territory of the country that it is representing, and so you cannot violate, you cannot go in there. If that doesn't make sense, just think Julian Assange, okay? I mean, there he is. The Brits couldn't go after him until Ecuador decided to kick him out. But anyway, we said, okay, we're in a digital era. Let's see if we can make a digital embassy, appealing to the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Immunity and Extraterritoriality. And it turned out that you can. You just have to negotiate. And so in Luxembourg today, we have, skip this theoretical idea, but we have one. We have in Luxembourg, in real-time, online, dedicated connection with these databases. So any change that happens in our national database in Estonia automatically takes place in the digital server. It's a server that simply has diplomatic and immunity and extraterritoriality. I mean, up till a couple of years ago, we were already concerned about this stuff, and every once in a while, we would deposit CD-ROMs with all of the national data to an embassy, and then the ambassador would stick it into a safe, so at least we had some kind of record. But now it just goes on all the time. And my recommendation to smaller countries is that, even if you don't have the history of invasion and occupation that a country like mine does, but if you're, say, Greece, and you live in a seismically active region, well, then it would make sense to store a copy of your important data outside the country. Now, if you're like Russia, the United States, it doesn't really matter because you're such a big country that, all right, you just put your data, a copy of your data somewhere else in the country. But here, we don't have that option. And as I said, given our history, fortunately, at least we don't get earthquakes, but other countries do, is to have a copy of your data. And this also is part of the integrity issue, because you don't want to lose your data. Not only do you don't want it to be changed, but you also don't want to lose your data, because once you're living in the digital era, that is the most fragile thing, is data, digital data. There's kind of this odd inverse thing. The hardest form of storage of data is what you see in Greece and in the city of Rome, where someone has spent, weeks and weeks chiseling out a single date, right? I mean, you have Roman numerals. They just want us to chisel it. That's permanent, almost. It's about as permanent as you can get. But the problem is you can't transport it anywhere, and creation of that data takes a very long time. Digital data, on the hand, you can create instantaneously, but, take a magnet over your computer, and that's it. It's gone. So you have to worry about your data if you want to go digital. Since I've managed almost perfectly not to go over my allotted time, I will end simply with this.
Ladies and gentlemen, Toomas Hendrik